So yes, today we're here to focus on how supervisors can support neurodiversity-affirmative PhD supervision. So I'm hoping that I'll make clear what that is as we go through. To start with, I'm going to do a very brief introduction and scene setting around neurodiversity and neurodivergence before we do the first of the breakout rooms. And then after that, we're really going to hone in on supervisory practices. Okay. So we are all hugely diverse. We have diversity within our society, in our world, in terms of biodiversity. Here we're talking about the diversity between us as humans, the diversity in our brains and the way that our brains are shaped by and utilize information from the world around us. We all process the same information in slightly different ways, and we are all extremely individual in the way that we take in information, process that information, and use it to guide our interactions, whether that's with other aspects of our environment or with the people around us. So we're really focusing on those individual differences between us as humans and the way that our diversity in the way that our brain processes information feeds into those individual differences that we see between all the people that we interact with on a daily basis. So the way that our brain processes social information, emotional information, the way that we might problem solve to be able to understand the situation that we're in, our memory capacity, etc. All of these aspects are part of our individuality and that make us who we are, and that's really crucial in understanding the differences between us as humans as well. So we can all think about our own profile of strengths and weaknesses. Some of us might have really exceptional memory skills, might be able to really hold lots of information in mind for a long period of time. We might be particularly detail focused and really great at being able to pick out specific differences in information. Perhaps we might struggle a little bit more in social situations or not feel as confident in social situations. So that might feed into our individual profile of strengths and weaknesses. And of course, other people that we work alongside, students that we supervise, and even other members of our families and our friends will all have slightly different profiles of strengths and weaknesses. It's really important for us to reflect upon our own strengths and weaknesses and what we bring to any working relationship, just as much as it is to understand the strengths and weaknesses or different profiles of other staff that we're working collaboratively with, or any students that we're working collaboratively with. So the real starting point for this is thinking about our individual profiles of strengths or areas of more challenge, areas where we feel more competent, areas where we might feel less skillful. And we can apply that to every single student that we work with. When we're working on postgraduate research supervision, we're working very closely with a student, often in a small team, because we've got so much team supervision going on these days, with a small team of supervisors and a student, or even on a one-to-one basis between a supervisor and a student. So there's the ability to get to know that profile of strengths and weaknesses. And it's really important that we do understand that and think about what that brings to the supervisory environment and relationship, but also crucially to the work that's going to be completed in that supervision and by that PhD researcher throughout their studies. So in understanding these individual profiles, in really thinking about understanding the strengths or the areas of more challenge for our supervisees, we're doing this before we even start to think anything about forms of neurodivergence. We're thinking about the individual variability that there is between all of us. And that's being neurodiversity affirming, because it's understanding all of the variation and the individual differences between us, irrespective of any aspect of formal diagnostic labels or anything else that might come with an individual, for example. So I always challenge people to really think about how much do you know about your own profile of strengths and weaknesses and feed that into your supervisory practices. And equally, how much time do you take to get to know the profile of strengths and weaknesses of your supervisees as well. But of course, we might be focusing on other aspects of a very broad neurodiverse profile, neurodiverse society and community of postgraduate researchers and colleagues. Neurodiversity refers to all of that diversity. It includes individuals who might be termed neurotypical or the neuronormative of society. This is where we might expect more commonality in the way that information is processed and used. It might be more like what we term the norm of functioning. We might be thinking about individuals with a wide range of different neurotypes or forms of neurodivergence. This image is just an illustration of the huge diversity of different types of neurodivergence that we might see within our student population or within society more broadly. Now, of course, this image presents lots of perfect circles with labels in them. In reality, obviously, there's much more overlap between these different conditions and different neurotypes than we might expect in this image. They don't occur in discrete isolation from each other, for example. We also, you might recognize that there are some mental health conditions on this image on the screen. We see huge overlap between neurodivergence and mental health challenges. And I'll pick that up in some of the session later on around supervision and supervisory practices. We do know that individuals with a variety of forms of neurodivergence are more prone to experiencing some more significant mental health challenges, especially anxiety and depression. Although personally, I wouldn't class them as forms of neurodivergence themselves, I would class them as forms of mental health challenge. So some students that we might be working with in supervision may have a diagnosis, may have a formal diagnosis. But for some individuals, we might not know that diagnosis, or the individual may not have a diagnosis formally, but might associate with having lived experience of a form of neurodivergence. And of course, that will intersect with all other types of variability that we see between us in society and humans. It's really important to remember that neurodivergence, isn't limited or specific to a particular gender, particular ethnicity. We see huge intersectionalities between these issues. Individuals might have multiple forms of intersectional membership of minority groups, for example, being part of an ethnic minority group, as well as having a lived experience of neurodivergence. Equally, individuals might have multiple forms of neurodivergence. In fact, for example, if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, it's probably more likely that you also have other co-occurring diagnoses of different neurotypes than to have ADHD on its own. So we know there is vast overlap and intersectionality between all of these issues. This has implications when we're supporting students, especially when we think about that interplay between neurodivergence and mental health, and especially when we think about trying to support specific minority groups in thinking about how the intersection of those minority groups might occur. Because, of course, we could term neurodivergence as a minority group itself. We expect about 1 in 20 individuals within society at the moment has a form of neurodivergence. But of course, especially at the moment where we have huge waiting times for diagnosis, we can expect that individuals might not all have a formal diagnosis. And this is where a real push towards a needs-based support, needs-based supervision, and needs-based disability provision within higher education and schools and employment, etc., all becomes particularly important. There can be many reasons why somebody might not have a formal diagnosis. They might have chosen not to go down that route and associate with the lived experience of a form of neurodivergence or a type of neurodivergence, but not wish to pursue a formal diagnosis. It may be that they have been referred for a diagnosis, but at the moment, with waiting times in some regions of the UK up to 3 or 4 years, and even longer sometimes for adult services, that can cause a significant delay in receiving sufficient support through medical routes. There's also a significant amount of stigma that we know is still associated, unfortunately, with having a neurodivergent diagnosis. And that might feed into a personal choice to pursue a diagnosis or a personal choice to reveal that diagnosis to other people. So we do have to acknowledge that our numbers are lower than we would expect there to be individuals with neurodivergence within society, related to this idea of not everybody having a formal diagnosis. That, of course, brings us back to the importance of understanding the individual and understanding their needs and their profile of strengths and weaknesses, and feeding that into supervision. Because it absolutely isn't the case where we should just be saying, well, what's the diagnostic label here, and assuming that that tells us everything we need to be able to provide the right and relevant support for neurodivergent postgraduate researchers. But actually, we are here to provide neuro-affirming supervisory practices that can benefit all students and additional support for neurodivergent students. But absolutely every higher education institution that we are working in has its own structures for supporting, for example, disability needs, or supporting or providing extra student support through other mechanisms. And when we can't provide support as a supervisor, we absolutely need to be relying on using those specialist services with trained people who are there to provide that support. So it shouldn't be that supervisors feel that there's a weight of burden on their shoulders to absolutely get this right. Our higher education institutions absolutely have additional support processes and mechanisms in place for that. And we need to ensure that that is based on the needs of the student. Quite often, a student might not go through or opt to go through disability services routes if they don't have a formal diagnosis, or they might not feel comfortable in doing so because in some ways it involves a disclosure that they might not be comfortable with making. And that's where, again, we come back to that needs-based approach of understanding the individual students that we're working with, because absolutely every single one of them will be different and will have different needs and different profiles of strengths and weaknesses. So let's start at the beginning of the PhD journey. That beginning period, that first few months and even the first year of the PhD, is an extremely daunting one for all students, for everybody beginning a PhD journey. We're coming from taught programs usually, so undergraduate taught programs or master's degree taught programs that have a very clear structure to them. You have modules, they might run for a set number of weeks that you're used to throughout that degree because it's the same for all your modules. You'll have clear learning outcomes, you will have a set piece of work that you know has to be given on a set date, and you know pretty much how the year ahead of you or the 2 or 3 years ahead for an undergraduate degree are going to pan out, at least as much as you can. What we know from some interviews and work that we've done with neurodivergent PhD researchers is that the uncertainty at the beginning of that PhD journey is much greater for neurodivergent students. And I would say, actually adding in here, what we've found when we've talked to neurodivergent PhD researchers is that international PhD researchers experience even greater challenges and uncertainty at the beginning of this PhD journey, especially if they've not completed their undergraduate or taught programs within the UK. So the more uncertainty, the more unfamiliarity we add into the story, the more this is going to specifically impact our neurodivergent PhD students. So we have to bear in mind that not knowing what is ahead of us, the lack of structure that we have at the beginning of that PhD journey will all feed into heightened risk of experiencing anxiety, uncertainty, and that having an impact on self-confidence and self-belief in being able to pursue the PhD right at the start of that journey. Not knowing what's ahead and wanting to understand how things are going to pan out exactly for the next 3 years is not uncommon for any PhD researcher, but is especially common for neurodivergent, especially autistic students. And of course, we can provide some certainty, some structure, but we can't on day one say how everything is going to lay out for the next 3 years, because a PhD will evolve and will change over time. But being clear about that in itself should help some of the knowledge around how things were going to work during the PhD. So we do need to recognise that onboarding PhD students at the beginning of that PhD, especially neurodivergent PhD students, and setting up ways of working as a supervisor become especially important. And we really need to be clear how supervisory relationships are going to work, how the supervision as a whole is going to be laid out and work and structured over the PhD. Because this PhD researcher is coming from a very different educational experience. They may have moved to a different city, a different university, a different country to complete their PhD. Our ways of working for a PhD versus for a talk program with lectures will be very different. They are going to start completing a project that they're very excited about, but that in itself is daunting and is scary in getting it right. And this whole 3-year period, or 4 years for some funding and some studentships, is a very long time compared to, let's say, a 10 or 12-week module that a student might have been working on a talk program. So supervisors can help with provide some additional structure and reduce some of the uncertainty that a student experiences during this transition point. We know transitions, periods of change, periods of uncertainty are all more challenging for neurodivergent scholars. We see it when we make shifts from primary education to secondary education to higher education, and here we see it when we're transitioning from taught programs into a research degree. So a supervisor in structuring how supervision is going to work can play a really important role in supporting this transition point for their neurodivergent students. So I would encourage you here to think about what you do with the start of the PhD for each of your incoming PhD supervisees. What do you do as an institution in terms of induction? And how might you be able to feed neuro-inclusive ways of working into that programme? There are some particular issues that we might want to focus on when we're really thinking about supporting any neurodivergent students. And there are terms that we call transdiagnostic experiences, because these are really useful to hone in on, as we know that they are particularly challenging or more prominent areas of concern for neurodivergent individuals, but actually we can all experience some challenges or differences in these areas at any time point. So we are supporting all students by supporting these areas. And also, we know that these issues are not specific to one neurotype than another. For example, supporting these areas aren't just useful for autistic students. They're useful for autistic students, students with ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, multiple forms of neurodivergence, and of course their overlap as well. So 4 of these I would mention are sensory experiences. If we're overloaded with the sensory environment, then that's going to really significantly impact how much we can pay attention and how much we can offer in an interaction, and how much we can process information, for example, during a supervisory meeting. Uncertainty I've already mentioned, and especially at transition points, are doing unfamiliar activities and things that we haven't done before. Planning and attentional support is really important, and especially for neurodivergent students. And again, adding structure and scaffolding structure, I'll explain, can be really useful here. Uncertainty and challenges with change and uncertainty, and challenges with sensory experiences, can impact how anxious somebody is and experiences of anxiety. And we do know that neurodivergent students, especially autistic students and those with ADHD, are at a more heightened risk for burnout, especially autistic burnout, than their neurotypical peers. So we really have to bear this in mind. And again, I'll pick up on this throughout the session today. But if we're thinking about where we might want to provide support to be able to suit the needs of lots of different neurodivergent students, but actually lots of other students who aren't neurodivergent as well, these are some areas where we can really focus our attention, and we can build support in to meet the needs of lots of different issues. If I just explain why some of these are so widespread, so anxiety is the classic one. we can all be anxious some of the time. We can all be anxious about giving talks or about having certain meetings or deadlines that we've got coming up. So experiencing anxiety isn't an unusual situation to be in. But experiencing clinical levels of anxiety will mean that that anxiety is really significantly impacting on anything you're doing, any of or all of the time. And we do know that neurodivergent individuals are at a much more heightened risk of experiencing clinical levels of anxiety. So if we think about our students, if our students, our PhD researchers are experiencing heightened anxiety, it's going to impact on all aspects of their PhD that they're trying to complete. It will impact how they can perform and attend and focus and process information in supervisory meetings. It will impact upon how they respond to feedback that we might give on work that's being completed. It will impact on their ability to plan a program of work that they need to complete, their ability to switch off and time manage appropriately and understand boundaries between their work life and non-work time, which might lead to significant burnout. If we're anxious, our writing skills massively deteriorate, as will our oral presentation skills. So there's a huge number of ways in which heightened anxiety can impact a PhD researcher in all aspects of their supervision and the work that they're trying to complete in their PhD. So bearing in mind how anxious somebody is while we're supervising them is really important for adapting what we're doing and making it appropriate for the needs of that student. And of course, there may well be situations where the best thing for a student to do when they're in an extremely heightened state of anxiety and significant burnout would be for them to take a period away from their PhD and return when they're in a situation where they're more healthy and able to focus and make progress. So I've mentioned about scaffolding uncertainty, because uncertainty is a really significant cause of anxiety, cause of concern for neurodivergent students, especially at the start of the PhD. And supervisors can do all sorts of things, and I'm just going to provide a few suggestions today, really, for thinking about how we can increase explicit planning, reduce uncertainty, and use really clear timelines and task structures to try to minimize uncertainty and improve and scaffold the structure and support we give to PhD researchers during our and through supervisory practices. Especially in year one, where somebody might be moving from a taught program to a PhD, thinking about those regular supervision meetings and knowing when a student's going to have the opportunity for supervision is a really important and useful thing for that student. So having a plan ahead for PhD meetings. Now, there's huge disciplinary differences in terms of how often a supervisor might meet with a PhD student, but having a clear plan that lays out exactly how often you will meet is a really useful thing, because a student then knows when their next opportunity is to meet with you. Now, of course, it's highly likely that you might also have back and forth email conversations during and between supervision meetings, but at least by having a clear schedule of supervisory meetings in place in the diary, preferably at the start of the academic year, means that at the very least the student knows that these are the opportunities that they're going to be able to have to meet with you. Some students will benefit from slightly longer meetings, slightly further apart. Some might benefit from shorter meetings closer together, just as long as they're not so close that you're going over the same things time and again and not making progress forward. And of course, it has to map with the supervisor's workload and supervisor's demands in terms of making that regular checking and the structure and timeline of how often you're going to meet work with a supervisory workload and the student perspective. And that's where conversations really early in that supervisory relationship, perhaps around a sort of some institutions have a contract of supervisory agreement that they use at the start of each academic year to lay out how that is going to be put in place. So having a clear schedule of meetings is really valuable. Thinking about how those meetings are going to take place when they do occur is also really valuable. So, for example, is it most useful for you to always have a clear set out agenda of items that are going to be discussed, and to have that available to you at the start or just prior to the meeting taking place? Is somebody going to write up some bullet points or some minutes from that meeting? If they are, how are those going to be shared? And I'll come to this in a second. Then there are varying different ways that supervisors and students might go about this, but being clear on the way that you're going to do this and sticking to that over time is really useful, and again scaffolds the structure that the student can expect. And this again is about a discussion between the supervisor and the student as to how it would work best. Some supervisors, when we've been discussing these issues, have said, well, we have a rule where we only discuss 2 key issues in each supervision meeting, so that we can really focus on those. Otherwise, we could go off on lots of different tangents, but actually we need to set boundaries on having a small number of key points that we would discuss in each meeting. And that might work really well for some students. If you're going to take minutes, how's that going to work? Some neurodivergent students might benefit from having their supervisory meetings recorded. And that might be especially the case if you're doing it, for example, over Teams, and you can record that session. But there might be other ways in which minutes are being taken or which notes are being taken from a meeting. I don't think anybody's suggesting that absolutely detailed minutes like you would have for a formal committee meeting are needed for every supervision meeting, but some clear bullet points that come out of the meeting are really useful, because then you can check if you're all on the same page from what's been discussed. You might have a shared document where that's added to each time you have a meeting, so that you can, so the student and the supervisor can check it. One thing that came up in some recent work we did with neurodivergent students was if the student was required to make notes or take minutes of this way, is that actually taking all of their ability to concentrate on what they're writing down in terms of notes, that they actually aren't then free to think about and discuss issues in the meeting? So, for example, if a student's got their head down typing notes the whole time for the supervisory meeting, and they then don't have the cognitive capacity as well to be able to think, to process the information, to discuss the issues, then you might just get 10 emails just after the supervisory meeting that highlight actually they haven't been able to process and understand what was discussed because they were just focusing on minute taking. So it's probably not the best use of their time. In those situations, it might be more relevant to say, okay, we're not going to write down anything during the meeting, but let's, at the end of the meeting, for the last 5 minutes, let's come up with 3 clear bullet points of what we've discussed. Or it may well be that the supervisor says, okay, I'm going to jot down 3 points of things that we've discussed after the meeting and send them to you. Again, these ways are just ways of making sure everybody's on the same page of what's come out of that meeting and any actions that have been determined, but also about enabling the student to be fully present to discuss the issues during the session. Structured objectives, again, feed into that idea of, are you going to have sort of an agenda of some key points that you're going to discuss, and how are you going to set that up with the student? Again, having this sort of approach of clear meetings, really structured in this way, reduce uncertainty for a lot of neurodivergent students, especially students who might have ADHD and might be wanting or trying to juggle lots of different tasks, but actually trying to just focus on one area of priority. And also for autistic students, especially if they're also experiencing heightened anxiety. But they're also really, really useful for students with dyslexia and dyspraxia as well, in terms of planning and providing structure that we know students with those conditions might particularly struggle with at certain times. So I would encourage all supervisors to think about how they get that structure in. In some ways, you might be treating supervision like a regular tutorial that you have with other student groups, because you have a clear structure that you're going to use it with it, and a clear way of working. And that can be actually really useful, especially in the first year and those transition point into the PhD for neurodivergent students. As part of that planning and part of that structure, it's really important to obviously think about the programme of work that's going to be done during the PhD. Neurodivergent students can sometimes try to take on too many things and try to do too much all at once, and might be more prone and specifically prone to saying yes to taking on lots of additional things that aren't their actual PhD research. And getting that balance right between making progress on the PhD project and wanting to take on and get involved with lots and lots of other things, sometimes that needs really careful consideration. And we've seen several cases where, when we've talked to neurodivergent students and we've talked to supervisors in some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years, we've seen this real issue where students have been great at taking on lots of things and really getting involved, but actually progress with the PhD has been quite slow because they've been juggling lots of other things. And more often than not, burnout has been caused by doing all of the additional things on top of the PhD, and that's really important to bear in mind. Now, that's not to say that neurodivergent students shouldn't only focus on the PhD research, but it's about the timelines that we put in place. It's about managing time commitments to different things. And it's about balancing that research part, the professional and personal development at different stages in the PhD, and not feeling that it all has to be done all at once, or it all needs to be done in year 1 and year 2 and year 3 and year 4 sometimes. So thinking about how you structure not just the PhD research, but other parts of professional and personal development, perhaps teaching commitments that might also be taken on, are really important in bearing in mind burnout and time management and planning. And especially also when thinking about the project, thinking about laying out clear deadlines, clear timelines for work will help with some of the planning challenges that we know that students might experience in this area. It's not uncommon for autistic and ADHD students to really struggle with time management. There are lots of these days support, online support software that people might use for planning, writing, some available even through ChatGPT, etc., for planning work. And that can be really useful to use for neurodivergent students to support with some of the structure of planning out time and time management more broadly as well. So those are considerations of adding structure and support in place for how and when we do supervision. But enabling conversations within supervision meetings is obviously really important as well. And that can come down to the way that we have discussions, giving room for thinking time, and thinking about what is of best benefit for the student that we work with. Now, if we've worked with this student before they complete their PhD, for example, in a master's degree or an undergraduate, we might already know how to capture some of their best skills in the way for adapting for our supervision. But for many PhD researchers, we might not have worked with them before they come to complete the PhD with us. So those first few months really will be about learning how to engage in the supervision meetings, because every student will be slightly different. And we certainly can't just base that on if somebody has a diagnostic label or not. So when we're asking questions, and this comes from when we're also having vivas, etc., trying to have clear, concise questions and perhaps scaffolding those questions with examples and concrete information is really useful. If a student doesn't seem to be answering the question that you're asking, feel free to rephrase it, and perhaps it's the phrasing that's being used that isn't quite coming across. And many students will ask you to ask that again in a different way if they're not sure. But for some students, they might not feel comfortable, especially at the start of that supervisory relationship, to do that. Allowing space during supervisory meetings for creativity and for thinking. We want supervision meetings to be absolutely crucial to the student being able to brainstorm, being able to come with ideas, for you to have really rich discussions during those supervisory meetings, not just as a touch base to follow up on something in writing. So in that sense, we need to make sure that the student can think and has space to be present and process information during that supervisory meeting. And there are obviously lots of individual differences to what might work for some students and others. Walking meetings might be really valuable for some neurodivergent students and supervisory teams, and being able to get out and not just sat at a desk, especially just sat opposite each other, etc. Standing or walking around and having a meeting, sitting on a chair, sitting on the floor, does it really matter if the student is able to really think and be present and process information and perform and get the most out of those supervisory meetings? So being open and flexible to ensuring that the environment, the sensory environment, the environment that the student is in, is really important for allowing them to feel confident, to share ideas, to problem solve, to brainstorm and discuss what's going on in their PhD during that supervisory meeting. And some indicators that this might not be the case for a student could be that constant or very quick after a supervisory meeting, lots of questions by email that kind of indicate that, oh, that's not what I thought that we discussed. Maybe we're not on the same page, or missing key things that were discussed in the supervision meeting. Not talking so much and just saying yes or just agreeing, being kind of subservient in a way during that supervision meeting, just yes, 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 and just not actually contributing. Really, especially if that's a change of behaviour for that student. Perhaps they're feeling overloaded at that time and not able to think and process what's going on. So changes in behaviour across supervision meetings might give an indication of what's going on for that student and whether they're struggling with some aspects of the PhD or, of course, with life more broadly, or burnout, etc. So that's really important. If a student suddenly changes the way they're interacting, if they are missing deadlines, for example, then there are things to be aware of. But really thinking about how we can enable discussions is really important, and not just assuming that that will be the same for every student, because it won't. It won't be the same for 2 autistic students or 2 students with ADHD. It won't be the same for 2 neurotypical students. So we do have to adapt our supervision and be prepared to adapt that to our students' needs. And that's where it's a really important marrying of the supervisory skills and the students' abilities that make that slightly different for every supervisory relationship. A couple of key areas where we might want to pay particular attention. The issue of feedback, and this is something that's come up quite a lot when we've done, well, I've done a lot of training in UK institutions over the last couple of years. I think I've done 20 or so different institutions in the UK and CDTs and DTPs around this issue. And this is something that comes up quite a lot from supervisors, is about responses to supervision, to feedback on work, especially written feedback on work. There is the idea that neurodivergent individuals might be more prone to sensitivity around, or what we call rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And this comes from the idea that over time, through childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood, autistic and neurodivergent individuals will experience more trauma-related responses, more stigma and bullying, which will lead to more trauma-related responses and more experiences of real rejection in life. So then receiving negatively phrased feedback feeds into that trauma-based response. We also know that we can often see a sort of emotions working on a real precipice where everything can be okay one moment, and then neurodivergent individuals might be more likely to experience very extreme emotions in one direction or the other at any point. And all of this can feed into challenges around responding to or getting feedback in different ways. So it's really useful as well to think about how we give feedback on written work, on presentations, in discussions of different types of working throughout that PhD journey. And students might have particular preferences for how they receive feedback. Supervisors might have particular preferences for how they give feedback, orally or in writing or both. But it's really important that that discussion does take place into what's useful for the student and what the supervisor can provide as well. Obviously, feedback as you get into the writing stage of the PhD is absolutely crucial. Obviously, a student should be writing at all stages of a PhD, but especially towards the end when they're doing lots of writing and they need to really use the feedback they're getting to refine the next draft. That's quite often where we might see issues emerging. And that's often where it can be useful to not just give written feedback on a text in terms of Word documents, etc., but to map that with then a follow-up meeting to discuss the feedback and how it's going to be actioned as well. Some of the issues that have been raised in other sort of training sessions that I've run around students not using the feedback that's been given to refine new drafts, or in one extreme situation that we had was a student not actually looking at feedback because they couldn't bear to look at the feedback, so they just avoided it, so avoidance of negative feedback. So it's really important we create a safe space where there is no judgmental aspect to the feedback. It is basically on the work. It's not about the individual and their abilities. And we think about how we shape the way that we give feedback for somebody to use it to the best of their ability. All of this is really important when we think about how we communicate to other people. This is relevant in supervisory relationships, of course, but actually it's relevant in any team we're working with colleagues as well as students and supervisory relationships too. We know that there's lots of evidence to suggest that communication flows easier when individuals are within neurotype pairs or communication pairs. We also know that therefore it is more challenging for communication to come across clearly in cross-neurotype pairs. So when a supervisor and a student are from different neurotypes, it means that we have to work harder to make sure everybody is on the same page. That's where those notes, those bullet points from supervision meetings come really important. It's where talking through feedback where somebody doesn't understand it becomes really important, because we shouldn't assume that somebody's going to interpret something in exactly the same way as we are going to interpret it. And that's a bi-directional issue. It's just as much important if you've got cross-neurotype communication for one partner to be able to make sure that somebody understands them as it is for the other partner. It's not just the responsibility of a neurotypical or an autistic or an ADHD person, it's everybody's dual responsibility. And of course, through none of this are we assuming that the supervisor is always neurotypical and the student is the one who might be neurodivergent. We have many neurodivergent academics and many neurodivergent supervisors, and many neurodivergent supervisors who will be supervising neurotypical students or neurodivergent students. So it's about cross-neurotype communication more broadly, and being prepared to put that extra bit of effort in to make sure you are coming across clearly, and that you're interpreting information from other people in the way that it's meant or they mean it to be interpreted as well. And I've mentioned burnout. All of this is really important when we emphasize that neurodivergent burnout is really common and hugely debilitating. It goes beyond any exhaustion that we might associate with general burnout if you're not neurodivergent or not autistic. We know that these mental health challenges and neurodivergence absolutely intersect with each other in an immense way. And this is why we really have to bear in mind the likely increased risk of burnout for all neurodivergent students and those with mental health challenges, and really put that in our minds when we're thinking about planning work. And we might actually need to be really quite firm with students that we think they're doing too much sometimes, because actually they might not always be the best judge of the increased risk of burnout they are of taking on too many things at once. So a really open conversation about the risk of burnout is needed relatively regularly, and especially if you see any sudden changes, flat mood, sudden irritability or responses to feedback in a way that you haven't seen before, or failing to turn up to meetings or meet deadlines, etc. It's a really important time for an open conversation. And just my last slide before we go into discussion is really just remembering that at the end of the day, every single PhD researcher is different. You might have supervised 2, you might have supervised 22. If you supervised 22, we've probably realised by now that every researcher is different, every supervisee is different, because every PhD they're completing, every thesis, and every journey before the PhD and what comes after will be different. And that's why PhD supervision and PhD studies provide such a different opportunity, but different challenges as well to undergraduate studies, where everybody will be completing the same module, etc. Adding neurodiversity into this variability brings another layer of complexity that we need to consider, but we also really need to ensure that everything that we're doing is neuro-inclusive, and that means that we are supporting all neurotypes in the way that we are allowing postgraduate researchers to thrive during their PhD.